Good afternoon, everybody. My name is T. Frank Kennedy. I'm the director of the Jesuit Institute here at Boston College, and it's my great privilege to be hosting this event, which is a celebration of John O'Malley's latest book, The Four Cultures of the West. And we've brought together a panel of academic people to react to this. We were planning also of having a non-academic person, a person from the real world named John Dillenschneider, who's a businessman from New York. And he, up until today, I guess, or maybe last night, he was ready and raring to come, and he called and said, unfortunately, he could not make it. So we are with our academic crowd, but we're going to try and make this as informal as possible so that we can include everybody here, and we hope we can have some kind of discussion and reaction together. After the four presentations that you'll hear, Franco Momondo from the Department of Romance Languages, the chair, it was his idea to draw this group together and to celebrate this event. And he will speak for 10 minutes and give kind of a summary of the text of the book, remind everyone and those who haven't had a chance yet to read it to hear some of the ideas that are expressed in Father O'Malley's book. And he'll be followed by Larry Wolf from the History Department here at BC, who will react, Louise Rice from the Art History Department at the New York University, who came up from New York in this terrible rain to be with us today. And finally, Jim Keenan from the Theology Department here of Boston College. No one was given a brief. There were no set questions that the participants were supposed to respond to. They were supposed to respond in the way that they saw fit and the way they would like to respond. So different ones will probably concentrate on different aspects of the book, and that's what we hope for. So at this point, let me turn over our discussion to Franco Momondo.
Even though John's book, Four Cultures of the West, is eminently readable and easy to understand, as are all of his writings, this particular book is not easy to, its message and its subject matter is not easy to grasp simply by knowing the title and a word or two about it. So we thought it would be best for me to give a summary of the work, mostly taken from John's own introduction. Now, even though this book is the fruit of all of John's lifetime of learning and scholarship and publication, and certainly derives from his previous publications, the book really marks a radical departure in John's scholarly publication, his contribution as a scholar. Though, of course, his works have always dealt with important, large, broad issues of broad relevance, and of crucial importance. They've always been more historically, chronologically more circumscribed. But here in Four Cultures of the West, John tackles no less than the entire sweep of Western civilization, looking at it alongside with God and the Trinity, as at the opening of St. Ignatius's spiritual exercises, looking down and trying to see some patterns and draw some order in this otherwise confusing mass of voices, figures, events, interpretations of reality. And what he offers here is an original, distinctive set of tools for understanding what has happened in these thousands of years, but by these tools representing four different, what he calls, cultures, ways of responding, of interpreting, understanding reality. And I'll quote some of his language to this effect. Frameworks of interpretive categories. There are four of them. I like to think of them for the ease of memory as the culture of the prophet. This is the prophetic culture. Then we have the culture of the professor, the academic professional culture. Then we have the culture of what I call the poet, the humanistic culture, literature. And then we have the culture of the performer, the artistic culture. Four cultures prophetic, academic, humanistic, artistic, the culture of the prophet, the professor, the poet, and the performer. Those labels are mine. This afternoon, we'll hear three different responses and reactions to this, but first we should know what exactly John means by these cultures. And I quote the introduction. This book is about four phenomena in the history of the West. I call them cultures. In illustrating their characteristics, I make large use of my specialty, the history of Christianity. I have written the book for anyone interested in either of those two histories, which for long periods were in fact almost indistinguishable from each other. Among other things which this book provides, it provides a framework of interpretive categories. The device I use for approaching my subject is a construct, four cultures. As the title indicates, the book is first and foremost about those cultures. With them, I hold up for appreciation phenomena deeply embedded in the history of the West, so deeply embedded, in fact, that we sometimes become oblivious to their import. These phenomena are still with us, though in radically transformed ways. So the book speaks a lot about the past, but it really is a tool to understand the present. The purpose of the book is to make us less oblivious of them and thus more appreciative. The book. I think I'm going to skip some passages that I had originally planned to read for the sake of time. I will talk then mostly about religious figures and movements, yet I will do so insofar as they are expressive of the cultures. By that term, I mean four large, self-validating configurations of symbols, values, temperaments, patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving, and patterns of discourse. And one question I would have, if the word from French historiography, mentality, would be part of this, or we could discuss that perhaps. I mean especially configurations of patterns of discourse and thus expressions of style in the profoundest sense of the word. Le style, c'est l'homme même. The style is a person, himself or herself. Okay, the four cultures. The prophetic culture. What has Athens to do with Jerusalem? Going back to Tertullian's famous question, which he answered, nothing was his answer. In this book, I take Jerusalem to stand for one aspect, only one aspect of the Judeo-Christian tradition, its insistence on the incomprehensibility, the transcendence, the utter otherness of God. I call this the prophetic culture. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, says Yahweh through Isaiah. Thus spoke the Holy One who writes straight with crooked lines. This prophetic culture is the culture that must speak out. It is a culture of alienation, of protest, of standing apart because one can do no other. Here gather the Puritans and the Jansenists and all those given to crusades. Fundamentalists, both religious and secular, are comfortable here. I was about to make a remark about the current political situation in our country, but I will not say anything at the moment. This is the culture of the martyr and the fanatic. It is a culture, above all, of the reformer decrying injustice and corruption in high places. It wills to transform a corrupt and unfaithful status quo into the genuine article. The academic professional culture. The culture of Plato and Aristotle, the culture of a certain style of learning, is the aspect of Athens with which many people today are familiar, at least on a superficial level. No historical survey in almost any discipline can omit mention of these two giants who rightly dominate Raphael's famous fresco, The School of Athens. Platonism, in its various manifestations, infiltrated into the thought patterns of the West from antiquity into modern times to such an extent that they became one They became one, almost indistinguishable. The writings of the fathers of the church evince this influence, and even though Augustine reputed the Platonists, he could hardly have been more deeply affected by them. In what follows, I take Plato's pervasiveness for granted. I also take for granted that other philosophers and thinkers from the school of Athens and the school of Rome influenced early Christians in important ways. Here, however, in the academic professional culture, I am interested not in how the relationship between Aristotle, for instance, and the Bible was variously understood in the different schools or in the ideas and philosophical systems of Plato and Aristotle, but in a certain style of learning and discoursing that they launched and that received its most rigorous, reflective, and aggressive form in the universities of the Middle Ages. That style is the analytical, questing and questioning, restless and relentless style in which we in academic are today immersed. It is a style of learning that is never satisfied, that is critical of every wisdom, that is insatiably eager to ask the further questions, and that is ever ready to propose yet another perspective. The humanistic culture. This is the story of great literature and of the modes in which it was interpreted and studied. Recent generations have forgotten or have never been told that Plato and Aristotle lost the battle to educate the youth of the Greco-Roman world. It was won by persons like Isocrates, who built upon foundations the sophists had to a great extent laid. Virgil, St. Ambrose, and St. Augustine was trained in the skills and ideals set forth not by Plato and Aristotle or the other philosophers, but by those deriving from the other traditions based on literature. They had an education steeped in poetry, drama, history, and rhetoric, oratory, what would come to be called later a humanistic education. And finally, the artistic culture. This is the culture that expresses itself in ritual performance, and John points to the Mass as an example par excellence within the religious field of a ritual performance. So this is a culture that expresses itself in ritual performance like coronation rites, graduation ceremonies, and Veterans Day parades. It is a culture of dance, painting, sculpture, music, and architecture, activities or products without which, it seems, ritual performance cannot happen. But these activities and products are not simply adjuncts to ritual. They have a reality of their own. And then he discusses the rivalry and the partnership between and among these various cultures, and invites us to hold them up and consider them and in their relationship to each other and in themselves, and how they speak to us and influence our being in the world today, with a caution that they are not the only cultures, and they are not as omniscient or as omnipotent as they sometimes pretend to be. And with that invitational rhetoric, as he defines the last part of his introduction, I leave the floor to our commentators. Thank you. Larry Wolf from the Department of History, Boston College.
Thanks, Franco. Thanks also for introducing all of the categories. I was going to take the introduction just a little bit further and give people an idea of what some of the high points are in each of the categories as you proceed through the book. The first discussion of prophetic culture moves from the world of the Hebrew prophets through Pope Gregory VII, culminating perhaps in Martin Luther and the message of prophecy that he brings to the Christian world in the 16th century. The discussion of academic culture
beginning with Aristotle, works through St. Thomas Aquinas, and ends in a discussion of the Council of Trent. There's discussion of the culture of the poets, of humanist culture, beginning with Virgil, works through Petrarch and Erasmus, perhaps principally, and ends in a discussion of Vatican II, noting the very different cultural style of Vatican II, which he places in Culture III from the Council of Trent in Culture II. And the discussion of art in the fourth culture focuses, I guess, largely on Christian religious art and on the struggle between Christian religious art and the movements of iconoclasm, first in the Byzantine Empire in the early Middle Ages, and then as posed again by radical Protestantism beginning in the 16th century, and I guess culminating in a triumph of art with the Baroque age. When I reflected on the book, one of the things that seemed most intriguing to me was the use of the term culture in the way that John has done it here, denominating each of these strands of learning, writing, and artistic production as a culture in itself. I would leave aside for the moment the question of the relation between high culture and low culture, elite culture and popular culture. These four cultures, as denominated here, tend to emphasize high and elite culture on the whole. It would be difficult to read the book and understand exactly where, say, the Super Bowl fits into this particular schema. Most interesting to me, though, is the fact that the sense of culture that is used here does not refer to our conventional anthropological notion of culture, in which we associate culture with the ethnographic and the national. And the multiplicity of cultures, in that anthropological sense, is often conceived of in ethnographic terms, rather than as terms of particular strands of learning within the Western world. One of the things I wanted to do was to think about the meaning of the word culture, and one of the things that I just wanted to check, because it was what I recalled, was that in the 18th century, which is the century that I work on, when people speak of culture, for the most part, they still mean agriculture. When you look at the great Encyclopédie of Diderot and d'Alembert, the article on culture is all culture de la terre. It's all about agriculture and farming. And it's only during the 18th century that the word begins to take on anything like its modern meaning. I did go to Dr. Johnson's dictionary. We actually have a very attractive, large format Dr. Johnson's dictionary over in O'Neill. And he, middle of the 18th century, defines culture with its first definition as the act of cultivation, the act of tilling the ground, tillage. So he's pretty explicit about that, but though he offers a second definition, which opens up the possibility of our modern sense of culture, when he says that it can be the art of improvement and melioration, principally applied to the soil, the improvement of the soil, of course, but the art of improvement more generally could obviously apply in other arenas as well. I did notice with great interest that Dr. Johnson also gives it as a verb, to culture, in which it means to cultivate or to manure. So that, I think, is an important point to keep in mind if we are inclined to overvalue culture. I did also go to some of the French texts of the 18th century, because the crucial lexicographical developments would probably be more likely to be taking place in French than in English, or in French first and in English afterwards. As I said, in the Encyclopédie, culture still definitely refers to agriculture, but even earlier already, I noticed that in the 1730s, when Voltaire is writing Le siècle de Louis XIV, he writes about culture de la terre, littéraire, for sure, and the development of French agriculture during the reign of Louis XIV, but he also uses the expression culture de l'esprit, the culture or cultivation of the spirit or the mind. And he uses it in a section that is very close to our sense of what culture would be today. That is to say, to describe why one could say that Paris during the reign of Louis XIV might be comparable to Athens or Rome in ancient times. So that seemed to me to point the way towards multiple paths for pursuing culture, as John has done here in this book. That is to say, culture de, right? You fill in the blank. You could cultivate any aspect of the spirit. And that would allow for the possibility of multiple cultures. The second thing that I thought about right away was the question of the West and the idea of four cultures of the West, because we tend to think in cultural history nowadays that the West itself is not something that we take for granted, that the West itself is something that is constructed over the course of centuries, and most particularly during the modern period, constructed with reference to other non-Wests or non-Western others that give the West its shape and contour and meaning for us. In fact, when I was reading the book, I was feeling that for the most part, it was not really about the West in the periods that were being described, but as John says at one point in the book, about the Mediterranean matrix of the West. That is to say, about the South rather than the West. And one of the things that's most striking about the book for me is the ways in which it rests on that Mediterranean matrix and is about our modern Western relation to the Mediterranean classical legacy. And you saw that when Franco was defining the categories, it's with reference to the ancient Mediterranean world, and that John then develops them over the course of centuries in a broader European context. And it's one of the reasons that the work is a work of such spectacular erudition is because John can do that, actually has the classical erudition to pursue these different styles from the ancient world through the medieval world into the Renaissance and early modern period. When I was thinking about what kinds of history books it reminded me of, I was thinking about other books that make use of that kind of classical erudition and look for the recurrence of classical themes and classical forms. And I was thinking about Pocock's Machiavellian Moment and the recurrence of classical republicanism in the early modern world. I was thinking of Peter Gay's first volume on the Enlightenment as treated as modern paganism and the ways in which the values of the classical world recur and are relived in the 18th century. I thought a little bit about Simon Schama's book on landscape and memory and the ways in which classical conceptions of the landscape are reformulated over the course of centuries in Western literary and artistic traditions. It takes the treatment, this particular treatment based on the classical world, is one in which it seemed to me that all roads led to Rome. And actually, while Franco was speaking and summing up the categories, it occurred to me that if we think of the four cultures, the first one is prophetic with a P, and that the second is academic with an A, the third is poetic with a P, and the fourth is artistic with an A, and they spell papa. So if there's a coded message for us there in terms of looking at Rome, that, then I feel very proud of having deciphered it. Otherwise, I feel like an idiot. We're actually teaching a course right now on Rome, Franco, myself, and Stephanie Leone from the Fine Arts Department. And I was thinking about Lorenzo Valla in Rome, because Lorenzo Valla is an important player in the book. He's someone who John talks about in connection with the poetic humanist tradition that develops in what he calls Culture 3. And I was thinking about how vividly and with almost a sense of hallucination, someone like Valla feels that he is still living in the classical age. And I actually had a passage on hand that I had brought to class with me the other day, and that I was just going to read you a little bit of, in which Valla writes about how the Roman dominion was thrown off as an unwelcome burden long ago. He says, but Latin, the Roman language, has been thought sweeter than any nectar, more splendid than any silk, more precious than any gold or gems, and has been embraced as if it were a god sent from paradise. Great, therefore, is the sacramental power of the Latin language. Truly great is its divinity, which has been preserved these many centuries with religious and holy awe by strangers, by barbarians, by enemies, so that we Romans should not grieve but rejoice, and the whole listening earth should glory. We've lost Rome, we've lost authority, we have lost dominion, not by our own fault, but by that of the times, yet we reign still by this more splendid sovereignty of the language in a great part of the world. Ours is Italy, ours Gaul, ours Spain, Germany, Pannonia, Dalmatia, Illyricum, and many other lands, for wherever the Roman tongue holds sway, there is the Roman Empire. I was thinking of this reading the book because it seemed to me that for these classical categories of culture to survive over the centuries, what would be needed would be something like this, some kind of profound consciousness of the classical world and classical values in order to maintain the continuity of these four cultures across the centuries. And of course, one sees it in the humanist world of the Renaissance with someone like Valla right there in Rome. I think one sees it as well in the world of the Enlightenment, which is of greatest interest to me, where people are still deeply formed by classical education, very much aware of classical values, where Cicero is alive for the philosophes as an interlocutor, someone whom they feel that they are communicating with and responding to. But I really wondered about whether these categories of culture continue afterwards. That is to say, with the breakdown of the extreme importance of the classical world that one finds in the Renaissance and then afterwards in the Enlightenment, whether in the 19th and the 20th century, whether it's still possible to continue sorting out these separate strands of culture, continuing from the ancient world into modern times. I did puzzle over Voltaire, say, who seemed to me a characteristic figure for the 18th century, someone who was deeply formed by a classical education. He was educated by the Jesuits, of course. And I tried to figure out what culture to put him in, because in his fierce hostility to the Roman Catholic Church and his dedication to its destruction under the slogan "Écrasez l'infâme," he seemed to belong to the prophetic culture of culture number one and be related to Luther. On the other hand, in his fierce questioning of everything, he seemed like a Socratic in the style of culture number two, the academic culture. And of course, the style of his plays and poetry would seem to put him squarely in the classically elegant mode of culture number three. And I wasn't sure how to sort him out in terms of his values. And what I wonder is whether beginning in the 18th century, it becomes harder and harder to sort out figures into, even principally into one or the other of these cultures. And I wondered whether that's because it's in the 18th century that you begin to see emerging all the more clearly that comparative study of human societies that will result in our modern ethnographic anthropological sense of culture, in which the West begins to be seen as one culture among many in the world, and therefore increasingly as one integrated and unified culture among many, sometimes beginning in the 18th century called civilization or Western civilization. If you think about the world of the 18th century, beginning in the 1720s with, say, Montesquieu and the Persian Letters, or Gulliver's Travels and the compared ethnographies of Lilliput and Brobdingnag, the world of the 18th century is very much aware of a comparative dimension to human societies in which Europe represents one cultural form among many. And I was thinking about the culminating exploration of the 18th century when Captain Cook sails the South Pacific and discovers a far greater variety of human societies than had hitherto been suspected. And when he writes about culture, it's very different from the world of Lorenzo Valla in the 15th century. Writes Captain Cook, both sexes paint their bodies tattoo. He's on Tahiti here, as it is called in their language. This is done by inlaying the color of black under their skins in such a manner as to be indelible. Some have ill-designed figures of men, birds, or dogs. The women generally have this figure Z simply on every joint of their fingers and toes. The men have it likewise, and both have other different figures, such as circles, crescents, etc., which they have on their arms and legs. In short, they are so various in the application of these figures that both the quantity and situation of them seem to depend entirely upon the humor of each individual, yet all agree in having all their buttocks covered with a deep black. Over this most have arches drawn one over another as high as their short ribs, which are near a quarter of an inch broad, and so on. A very detailed description of what we would recognize as Pacific Islander culture, and one which stands in very dramatic contrast, I think, to all of Cook's description seems to me to stand in very dramatic contrast to all of the kinds of cultural Western styles that we talk about in the four cultures of the West. And I was going to end there with the culture of the tattoo, right, which takes us into the modern world of the 21st century, and a sense of all the different competing concepts of culture that one might have to deal with as one moved into the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries.
And now we have Professor Louise Rice from the Fine Arts Department of New York University.
Thank you very much. And may I just say what a pleasure it is to be here on this happy occasion as we pay tribute to John O'Malley, our friend. I suppose there probably isn't another scholar in the whole world who knows as much about the rhetoric of praise as you, John, but in this particular instance, you find yourself on the receiving end and must sit quietly by while others heap praises upon you. Four Cultures of the West is not a big book in terms of page numbers, but in terms of its content, it's absolutely vast. As Franco said before, it offers nothing less than a structural framework, a construct, as O'Malley puts it, for tracing and analyzing the intellectual history of Western Christianity, from antiquity to pretty nearly the present day. No small feat, I think you'll agree. And it's testimony to O'Malley's immense learning and mastery of his subject matter that he makes it all seem so easy and effortless. He has a rare knack for making intelligible and engaging even the most difficult and abstruse subject matter, and for painting the big picture, for giving us a glimpse of the big picture. He writes also in a relaxed, straightforward, almost conversational style that makes this book a real pleasure to read. Now, Larry has talked a little bit more about the interpretive categories that O'Malley uses in his analysis of Christian culture, The last of the four cultures that he deals with, culture 4, is the culture of art and ritual. And since I'm an art historian, it falls to me to discuss a few points that have to do with this particular chapter. O'Malley distinguishes this culture of art and ritual from the other three by virtue of the fact that its mode of expression is essentially nonverbal. This aspect makes it seem at first the odd man out, in some ways out of sync with the other three phenomena under discussion. Christianity, I think it's fair to say, is a profoundly logocentric religion. There's that little bit you all remember about how in the beginning was the Word, right? It doesn't say in the beginning was the icon. In the beginning wasn't the picture or the image or the likeness. In the beginning was the Word, whatever that means. Yet images do hold a tremendously important place in Christian discourse. And if they themselves communicate non-verbally, they are nevertheless so closely involved with verbal ideas, so enmeshed in an interpretive register that demands to be read and to be realized verbally in some way, that the distinction between verbal, nonverbal seems sometimes hardly relevant. At the very least, I would say the boundaries between culture 4 and other verbal cultures are very permeable indeed. Horace understood this when he said, ut pictura poesis, poetry like painting, painting like poetry, and he could have added, of course, ut sculptura poesis, too. And this was an idea that both poets and artists took very seriously indeed. The poets striving to achieve vivid pictorial effects through their language, the painters conversely striving to express the moral values that were the purview of the poet, and also to participate in the richness and subtlety of the poet's metaphorical language. Ut pictura poesis implies, in the terms of O'Malley's construct, a close alliance between cultures 3 and 4, the humanistic culture, the culture of literature, and culture 4, the culture of art, and overlapping, which seems to me sometimes, in fact quite often, really to be a true fusing of their identities. And I wanted to talk a little about one example that may shed some light on this coexistence, let's say, of the two cultures. Consider the case of what is certainly one of the best-known works of the Roman Baroque, Bernini's Ecstasy of St. Teresa. I don't need to show you a slide. I'm sure you can all visualize it in your mind's eye. It's an extraordinary image, dramatic. The saint is shown falling back in a half swoon. She's levitating. She's actually raised up above the ground and on a cloud. Her head is thrown back, her eyes partially closed, her lips parted. The angel stands next to her. What is represented is the miraculous experience of the so-called transverberation, when she feels her very entrails pierced by this golden arrow held by the angel. As Bernini represents the subject, it is an extraordinarily erotic image, an image of a woman in an ecstatic state of physical entrancement. But in representing the scene this way, non-verbally you could say, Bernini is really only realizing the words of St. Teresa herself, as she wrote them in her autobiography. She describes her ecstatic experience in very down-to-earth language, but language which is itself highly charged and highly erotic in content. She talks about the exquisite pain, the moans that she utters, and so on and so forth. It's really quite a startling passage. Reading chapter 3 in Four Cultures of the West, the chapter on the culture, the literary culture, I learned that Teresa herself got the ideas that informed the description of her own ecstatic experience from authors like Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, whose homilies are just extraordinary, passionate, involve an extraordinary, passionate eroticism, very, very similar in type, although more poetically expressed. St. Bernard talks about the inward pulsing of delight. He talks about the lover and the beloved. He talks about the endless union with God, and so on. These are all ideas that find reiteration in Teresa and then eventually in Bernini's statue. So from Bernard to Teresa to Bernini, they describe the idea using different languages, but the idea itself remains constant. And it is an intensely poetic an idea that's entirely couched in a language of metaphor. Bernini shares with the poet a delight in layering meaning in this work, in taking advantage of this flexible hermeneutic, that's a phrase that O'Malley uses, to convey the scene using a language that we associate with physical eroticism to express actually its exact opposite, namely a purely spiritual union with the divine. This kind of exchange between a verbal and a visual field is beautifully summed up in a quote that is included by O'Malley, a quote from Hieronymus Emser. I just wanted to read this one phrase. I found it very striking. What more can the written word be than a sign that signifies and indicates something else, which is exactly what images do? A kind of equivalence is being drawn then between the language of words and the language of images, and it's an equivalence that, of course, works both ways. While we still have Bernini's image in mind, I think it's very interesting to note that Protestant visitors to Rome in the 17th century and in the 18th century, they were really quite astounded and nonplussed by Bernini's Saint Teresa. I mean, they tended to react either with stern disapproval or with, sort of lewd titters and insinuations. And you know that it wasn't just generic Protestant iconophobia that was behind their reaction. They were reacting to the extraordinary visual language that Bernini uses in representing this scene. It's the same with other works of Catholic/Christian art that Protestants encountered. Michelangelo's Pietà, for example, in the view of Tobias Smollett when he visited Italy, was very nearly a pornographic work as he saw it. This beautiful young man lying in the lap of this beautiful young woman. He thought it indecent. And it is interesting how one and the same image can strike people so completely differently, depending on the different sets of expectations with which they approach it and the different values that they have. Images do seem to have a very particular power. And I suppose one could say that Protestants really weren't wrong to be worried about them. They were never merely a Bible for the illiterate. They were always, among them at least, miracle-working images that were venerated and adorned and, also prayed to. And this was not just among the superstitious and the ignorant. During the famous plague, during the pontificate of Gregory I, Gregory took a holy image of the Madonna and Child and processed through the streets of Rome carrying this image. And sure enough, lo and behold, St. Michael appeared over Castel Sant'Angelo, sheathing his sword, and the plague ceased. And a millennium later, Alexander VII did pretty much the same thing during the plague of 1656. And once again, lo, the miraculous image, a different one this time, was effective in ending the plague. I can understand the fear of images that entice or tempt the viewer into a kind of a danger of falling into idolatry. I can understand it when the image is itself a Christian image, when its subject matter is Christian. But it's harder for me to understand it when the subject matter is of a different religion altogether, especially a discredited religion. And yet, the statues of the ancient pagan gods were also capable of causing great consternation, and even I would go so far as to say fear. O'Malley cites a very interesting case of an early Christian matron who had a collection, apparently, a veritable gallery of statues of pagan deities in her palace in Rome, and apparently these caused her no difficulty at all. But there are other cases one can cite where the opposite is true. One of the most interesting that I know of involves a recent discovery made in the city of Carthage in North Africa. Archaeologists have been excavating an early Christian basilica in Carthage. There's almost nothing left of it, really just the foundations. Below the stone threshold of the entrance into the church, they discovered a ritual pit. It had been filled in, of course, but they excavated the infill, and at the very bottom of the pit, they discovered a statue of Venus, nude, perfectly severed down the middle and across the waist. In other words, she had been ritually executed. She had been drawn and quartered, essentially. And the dismembered chunks of her body had been placed in this pit, covered over so that she forms the foundation stone on which this Christian basilica was then raised. And this is a very extraordinary example of an image that is so potent, it needs literally to be punished, to be executed, and on the exorcised remains of this body, then the strength of the church can be built. This was something that happened, of course, in the early years of the church, and at the time there were still perhaps pockets of paganism. The taint of the pagan idols was still so fresh that one can understand that it still held a power to incite fear. What's more extraordinary is that, a millennium later, the same thing was true. When Pope Sixtus V started erecting the obelisks around the city of Rome, he went through an elaborate ritual of exorcism. And having exorcised these pagan monuments, he then crowned them with a crucifix. And in the bronze crucifix, he placed relics of Christian saints. So a kind of double exorcism of these needles of stone, as though after all these years, there's still some trace of the pagan numinous spirit hiding in them that needs to be pushed away. Whether in fact these rituals were more for the fun of them and for show, to what extent people really believed. Almost that's not so important as the rhetoric of the image that is conveyed, and clearly it was powerful indeed. O'Malley ends his book with an invitation to his readers to come outside and play, basically. He reminds us that his construct, his four cultures, are not writ in stone, and he challenges us to come up with others, to switch them around, to mix them up, to make a game, in a way, of them, and to see what new perceptions, what new ideas this kind of intellectual game can generate. I expect it's probably true that one could come up with other cultures. In fact, O'Malley comes up with a few others at the end himself, although he doesn't spend any particular time on them. But in fact, I like his number 4. I think it's a good round number. It's the kind of number that they would have loved in the Renaissance. It's a number full of symbolic meaning, symmetrical and harmonious. It's the number of the Gospels and of the seasons and of the cardinal virtues. It's the number of the humors, of course, also. It's also the number of of the walls in a room, most rooms anyway. And in particular, it's the number of walls in one particular room with which I'd like to end, and that's the Stanza della Segnatura, with, among other things, the School of Athens, the image that Franco mentioned, that John O'Malley mentioned several times in the course of this book. The Stanza della Segnatura, one in the suite of rooms that made up the private apartment of Julius II in the Vatican Palace, was frescoed by Raphael beginning around 1506. His frescoes include the vault and also the four walls of the room. In the vault, at the cardinal points, he paints female personifications of four of the major branches, let's say, of human knowledge, specifically philosophy, theology, poetry, or perhaps better, letters, and jurisprudence, or law. And then on the walls directly below those personifications, he paints really what is his greatest masterpiece, probably four large walls in which he then explores these same themes in fuller detail. Underneath philosophy is the School of Athens, focused on the figures, the central figures of Plato and Aristotle, who rule supreme, surrounded by all of the other philosophers and men of letters in Athens, in antiquity. All of the other philosophers and men of science, I meant to say, of antiquity. Opposite the School of Athens is the fresco known as the Disputa, associated with theology. It features at the center the chalice and Eucharistic wafer placed at the center of an altar and surrounded by figures of church fathers and theologians who are debating, madly discussing the nature of transubstantiation. The third scene represents Parnassus, the mountain sacred to Apollo and the Muses. This is the wall given over to poetry. And here you see Homer, Virgil, also Dante, Petrarch, and other more modern poets. Finally, on the fourth wall, jurisprudence, represented by some fragmented scenes of law giving. It's conceivable, in fact, maybe even likely, that at one point the Stanza della Segnatura was intended to be used to house the personal library of Julius II. And it's been suggested that the scenes represented reflect the, let's say, the division of subject matter within his collection of books. This is certainly very possible. Raphael represents basically branches of knowledge, disciplines, if you like, even academic disciplines, which seem indeed very suitable for a library. Now, how does all this relate to the question of the four cultures of the West? Well, to tell you the truth, I'm not really sure that it does, except that I was struck by parallels that kept jumping out at me. Similarities, but also differences, and both revealing. Some of the frescoes actually conform very neatly to O'Malley's division into four cultures. The School of Athens fits perfectly with his culture too, the culture of academia, the culture of the university. The Disputa first seems maybe to relate to culture one, the culture of the prophet, the culture of mystery, the ineffable, mysterious nature of God. It does, after all, center on the mystery of the Eucharist, but not the way Raphael treats the subject, surrounding the Eucharist with scholars, essentially in heated debate. Even the title that the fresco came to be given over the course of time, the Disputa, is a direct allusion to the kind of scholastic debate that is firmly associated with, again, culture too. The School of Athens and the Disputa, according to O'Malley's division in cultures, both belong in culture too and are essentially two sides of the same coin. Parnassus, on the other hand, fits very nicely with culture three. The law wall has no exact equivalent. I imagine that lawyers would belong in O'Malley's culture too, although if they were going to be effective in helping their clients, they would probably be well advised to have one foot planted in culture 3, the culture of rhetoric and persuasion. There is no culture 4 represented in the school of in the Stanza della Segnatura, no fresco devoted to art per se, although I guess one could argue that since the entire cycle is a work of painting, art speaks for itself here and is the medium through which all of the rest of these ideas come forth. There are, of course, strong differences here. Raphael's categories are simpler than O'Malley's. They are simply disciplines, whereas O'Malley's involve not only the matter, but also the format, the mode of expression of the different ideas. But it does seem to me, nevertheless, that the two works have in common a desire to classify, to divide, in each case, into a 4-part system of classification. How to put it, the intellectual activity of Western civilization. Both have in common, both face certain similar problems as well, by the way. I mean, O'Malley often has difficulty deciding whether a particular individual should fit into one culture or another because he has elements of both. I mean, for example, origin shows up in 2 of the cultures in some detail. Raphael has exactly the same problem, and most notably has to represent Dante twice so that he can fit him in the Parnassus in his role as a poet, but include him also in the Disputa because of his contributions to theology. So it's interesting to see the kind of solutions to the same problems showing up. Above all, both have in common the idea of prizing apart and isolating strands that, when woven together, make up the intricate tapestry of human civilization. They do this the better to appreciate the beauty of the individual parts and the marvelous complexity of their interactions. Thanks.
Now, Professor James Keenan of the Department of Theology. Thank you.
I ought to acknowledge that I've known John since 1979. I lived with him in the Jesuit community where I was doing my studies at Weston for 3 years. And then when I joined the faculty at Weston, I lived with him for another 13 in small community. Inasmuch as I left my family home at 17 to enter the Society of Jesus, only my mother has had to live with me as long. But I want to add that I think that I know in my own intellectual formation, other than Father Fuchs and Father Demmer, with whom I studied in Rome for 5 years, John O'Malley has had the most formative influence on me. And therefore, in order to give any tribute to him, I should answer the basic question that John poses with any real issue of research, and that is, so what? So what? I just want to make 2 points, both regarding the relevance of John's book to my field of theological ethics. First, a very simple insight that we might expand on in our discussion. I am often asked to speak on moral reasoning. Everyone asks me this. I think, though I could not name this before, had I not read John's book, that everybody wants an answer from culture too. They want a nice prescriptive little handbook for step 1, get the data, 2, reflect, 3, consult, 4, judge, 5, act, and as I suggest, 6, get ready to apologize. They would like it to be the new 10 Commandments, more comprehensive, more cutting edge, more gender inclusive. While I certainly acknowledge the relevance of culture too in relevant data or long-standing codes, principles, and norms, I invariably go to culture 3. I refer them to Aristotle's insight that to learn moral reasoning, one should learn from the prudential person. Rather than a code or a list, Aristotle gave his students practically wise people to emulate, to think like. Similarly, he gave the lessons on the virtues to these students to help them to become more prudential and more social and more virtuous. When Aristotle actually did write on moral reasoning itself, his method was not a deductive application of a principle to a situation, but rather he was more inclined to inductive logic that relied heavily on analogy. In fact, in a wonderful book on moral reasoning, The Abuse of Casuistry, the authors tried to recapture, the highly creative mode of moral discourse of the exploratory 16th century. And the authors found the method's forerunner not in Aristotle's ethics, but in his rhetoric. In John's book, now I have a way of inviting my students to turn to Culture 3 when looking for moral reasoning, though certainly they need to know the norms of Culture 2. Now, my second point. I want this to imitate John's own mode of presentation, a nod to the third school, the rhetorical. And I want to illustrate the effectiveness of the four cultures when they come together for an enduring humanitarian ethical crisis. I think it's a real tribute to John that we have here this evening someone in modern languages, somebody in art history, somebody in history, myself in theology and ethics. The different audiences to whom or for whom John's book is applicable, I think is really deeply relevant. And so I would like to take this into a very big so what question. Let me explain. I work in HIV/AIDS. Let me just give you some data for a second. More than 20 million people have already succumbed to this epidemic, and annually 3 million people die. 8,200 people die per day. An estimated 42 million persons are living with HIV infection today, and each year 5 million more people become infected. The epidemic is currently poised to spread especially rapidly in Asia and the former countries of the Soviet Union, with already 1% of the Russian population being infected. For instance, India just bypassed South Africa as having the most number of citizens infected, 5.5 million, while South Africa has 5.4 million. Estimates for cumulative new HIV cases between the year 2000 and 2025 just in China, India, and Russia range between 66 and 250 million people. How to marshal the world's attention to this phenomenon? How to marshal the world's attention to this phenomenon? An enormous challenge in light of the really weak response we've been giving over these past 25 years. However, I had the good fortune this past summer to attend the HIV/AIDS conference in Bangkok last July, where, though I was the only person in theological ethics there were 20,000 participants present, as were each of the four cultures. I say this because I believe that John O'Malley's book is not only descriptive, it is also prescriptive, and if you're in ethics, that's what counts. It's prescriptive for people like myself who believe that we need to strategize to awaken contemporary consciousness to enormously urgent issues. John has provided us with a strategy for moving forward. Let me describe the presence of the four cultures at Bangkok last July. Culture 1. The prophetic was present by the activist. Among the activists were the radicals, like ACT UP Paris, who were just very clear and very emphatic. Their message was simple, and it was about justice. For instance, whenever a major European or American official began to speak about their so-called contributions to the Global Fund, a group of 75 to 150 radicals broke in, chanting their mantra, "You lied to us." And when the pharmaceuticals became present, they were particularly powerful, these radicals, in responding to, say, the president of Pfizer. Certainly they were disruptive, but they were also effective. At the closing session, two major figures testified to these prophets. The first was Peter Piot, the executive director of UNAIDS, who acknowledged that the work of all others laboring in HIV/AIDS would not be where it is today were it not for the activist, prophetic radicals. Echoing ACT UP itself, Graca Machel, the wife of Nelson Mandela, named the Bangkok Conference the first to summon all nations to never break their promises again, to never lie to us. Culture, too, the academic was very much present, especially in the clinicians and in the public health officials making their reports. I think of culture, too, as looking for the data, the truth. And at the AIDS conference, there were literally hundreds of papers, a real indication of culture, too, being present. Papers including in the plenary sessions where state-of-the-art reports address the effectiveness of prevention strategies like abstinence programs, condom usage, and needle exchanges, the state of the global fund, the relevance of patenting, the development of the virus itself, vaccine strain trials, and the development of microbicides. What was especially impressive was that the best papers came not from the industrialized world, but from physicians and researchers in the developing world. The world of scientific investigation was no longer singularly dominated by the northern Western world. Clearly, we all went to Bangkok for these papers. They were the battle reports about the success and failures of the war on HIV/AIDS. And it was there how I saw that the academic really has its real relevance to the world. They were the ones who were giving us the true indications of where we were in the battle against AIDS. Still, John remarks in his book that this culture has an elitism about it, and whenever journalists or others wanted to dismiss the relevance of the conference, they would do so by calling the conference scientific light, though that was not the case. Still, for all the effectiveness of the conferences as a gathering of the best people in the field, this assessment was probably the most pernicious and the most hurtful. Nothing can harm a conference more than attacking the presence of culture, too, as being rather weak. I want to skip for a second the third culture and move to the fourth culture. Hosting the conference in Bangkok itself was a poetic choice. As John never tires of reminding us in the book, we are often shaped by our context and by the institutions we create in order to do what we want to do. This was the lesson John learned in writing The First Jesuits, about how the Jesuits not only developed their schools, but were in turn shaped by them. There was something terribly forgiving about the conference being in Bangkok, a certain unspoken but presumed sense that we were all welcome despite the prophets. We were shaped by a Buddhist world where orange-robed boys and men passed us by with a serenity and a sense of humor that we tangibly felt. And the humor that we needed came through their symbolic world. For instance, during a break in the plenaries, a team of 6 enormous elephants would waltz down the main road in gorgeous draperies, but each elephant carried in its trunk an enormously inflated condom that the elephant waved like a 3-foot balloon. Condoms were an image for Culture 4. At one point, there was a floor show of 15 dresses made out of condoms. They were actually incredible. The symbolic message was clear. In a world in which the most vulnerable to HIV/AIDS infection are 15 to 20-year-old married women, not only men needed to know about condoms, women needed to as well. Still, the most significant expression of Culture 4 at the Bangkok conference was a global village that was at the heart of the conference. It was a beautiful oasis filled with the art of countries most infected by the disease. It was a place in which people infected with the disease could retreat for moments of rest or prayer. Yes, we had 3 chapels at this AIDS conference for rest and prayer. And it was a place, we also had liturgy. We had Catholic masses at this AIDS conference twice a day, as well as a variety of other religious services woven in. And it was a place where the other participants could retreat when culture, one, was so bothersome, and two, was so taxing. It was a wordless place of refreshment and of humanity. I want to conclude on culture 3. Clearly it was culture 2. If culture 2 was the main stuff of the conference, culture 3 gave the data a human face. Throughout the conference, which comfortably held 20,000 persons, all working against HIV/AIDS, we were constantly passing signs, testimonies, and witnesses to this struggle in the hallways as we went to any of these enormous conference rooms. But it was at the closing conference that Culture 3 really came alive, in the testimonies of Nelson Mandela and Sonia Gandhi. Remembering their words, I recall what John O'Malley writes, that rhetoric leads to the communication of policies and the making of decisions advantageous to the common good. Yet before they presented, 10 people of different colors, classes, and ages stood on the stage. They were members of the Culture Committee. The first stood, these 10 people across the stage, and said, I am a woman. I am infected with HIV/AIDS. Do not let me die before you meet again in Toronto in 2006. The last to speak up, to stand forward, was a 10-year-old boy from Kenya. I am a boy infected with AIDS. I need my meds, but I need doctors to speak with me clearly and patiently, knowing that I am a child. They need to know I am only 10. They need to love me too. Among the others were a man who was a father and a husband who wanted a new image of masculinity in order to be a better loving father and husband and man. There was a tired healthcare worker, and there was a bewildered clergyman. They were all images of humanity deeply affected and involved in the crisis. They were the variety of constituents, and their rhetoric animated us. At the center of these 10 was a late 20-something, very striking, very Thai, very long black hair, slender, and fretting all the time as the others spoke. Then the person spoke. I am your son. I am your daughter. I am your brother. I am your sister. This was clearly a transgender person, and none of us had anticipated this. A room of 20,000 people, you can imagine. And the person went on, I am mocked and hurt. I have been beaten up and thrown in the gutter. I have been rejected, and I am very afraid. I am not infected, but I ask you to protect me. I am tired of the rejection, the hurt, the ostracism. Somehow, this transgendered person affected everyone by his courage and witness. There we saw a new everyman or woman in front of us. Rhetoric broke us through boundaries we never expected to break. Only Culture 3 could have done that. Thank you.
The floor is now open for your comments and discussion.
I might say that at the end of my reading of the book and contemplating the situation of the church today, the book helped me to realize that a lot of the problems that we have in the church, the Catholic Church today, is the conflict between cultures, in the sense that John describes them and intends them. That people's approach to the faith and to ethics is radically different, and there we have the philosopher competing with the performer, with the poet, etc.
When I read John's book, what I thought surveys the whole of Western culture, and then some. I think it actually sort of surveys world literature. Northrop Frye's Anatomy of Criticism. And I forget Frye's precise vocabulary, but the part I remember is where he sorts all the mythic elements. I think he uses the word mythic into 4 genres that he thinks divide the basic plots, I guess, or constellations of symbols. The 4 genres are romance, tragedy, irony, comedy. And so I was tempted to try to match John's 4 types to Frye's 4 types. And it probably is an effort that would take too much conversation to make it totally intelligible. But there are some interesting similarities if you paired romance with the humanistic, tragedy with the prophetic, irony with the academic, and comedy with the performative, I think, because for Frye, the comedy is the most complete. It's the ultimate revisualization or reconception of the human community. Anyway, if anybody knows anything about Frye, they might want to comment, but if not, we can go on to the next question.
Yes.
The panel would address what might be controversial about the wonderful survey and structure of Western culture, and you've given marvelous images, all of you, analogies. But if someone, if you could imagine someone attacking the book, what would they attack on the basis? And I wonder, I'm sitting here thinking, well, what an answer. I would imagine it's because science is in a way tucked under the academic as a little subcategory, whereas in the mainstream intellectual notion, science is the major cultural category now, opposed to everything else. Sort of the true culture notion, C.P. Snow. So, and in everything else, I was thinking, well, what everything else includes. It includes things like religion, which is considered not very important. Talk about that. It includes art and literature, entertainment, which is considered not very important. It includes practical life and technology and jobs, which is considered important, not very glamorous. It includes politics and law, which is considered very important. So I was just, maybe, is that the controversial element of the book? So, to finish my point, that religion roams around this book all over the place. The prophetic, then culture 1, or culture 2 includes Aquinas. Culture 3, premium example is maybe a sermon. Culture 4, the art, premium example is the Mass. So, is the controversial nature of the book, it's trying to make religion important in Western culture over against science.
Well, it did, I mean, I'll only say this much, that it did occur to me maybe the title could have been different. 4 cultures of Western Christianity, I would have called it. Because although some sections where that deal with the 19th and 20th century are not necessarily, strictly speaking, connected with religion, they make up a very small part of the book overall. Most of the book deals with people who, in one form or another, are involved in religious discourse. Yeah.
to answer your question, in my presentation, I deliberately used a non-religious context because I wanted to demonstrate the applicability of each of the 4 cultures. Even though I'm in theology, that's precisely where I went. For me, though, I think that each of us have this, and I'm sure that John would. It's not the controversy about it, but I think that what people will eventually criticize about the book is what drives all of us crazy when we're reading it. And that is, just when you think you've got somebody in that culture, you find Voltaire, and you go, well, where would I put him? And then John keeps telling you, I'm using this heuristically. I'm not, my boundaries are porous. But there's something slippery with those porous boundaries. So at the end, I think that the criticism will be, that the book couldn't do the 2 things that it's trying to do, to respect boundaries, but also to open them, because it's about trying to understand or appreciate these cultures when they're together, or when they're separate, or when they're confronting one another. But I don't think anything else could have been done. So in a way, the criticism is to the integrity of the research. That's what had to turn out. But all of us, I'm sure, the second time I was reading this book, I was like, yeah. Because I was thinking of the exceptions. And then the next day I'd go back to it, and suddenly I was in a place that I could go deeper and trust the journey better.
I thought that one of the things that might be discussed with reference to the book, I don't know whether it would be controversial or not, would be the way that Luther is dealt with in the 4 cultures, and the rather large role that he plays in the book. And I noticed it especially because it seemed to me in some ways he played a rather small role in the first Jesuits, as part of an argument that that was not what the first Jesuits were all about, responding to Luther, that they were about many other things besides that. Whereas here, he really marks the end point of the development of, well, not really yet, because you go on to abolitionism and the civil rights movement in Culture One. But the end point, at least, of the early modern discussion of Culture One, and to situate him, in relation to Pope Gregory VII, I thought was rather interesting because it situates him as a Catholic reformer rather than as a Protestant heretic. And I thought that was sort of historiographically quite interesting and well done. And I was very intrigued and even a little disturbed by the way that he crept back in the discussion of Culture 4 as someone with the potential to bring down the boom on the Western artistic tradition, which he doesn't do. But Protestantism's role there, radical Protestantism, but perhaps Luther as well, in some of his comments, seem to play a darker role in the discussion of Culture 4. And I wonder whether putting together those pieces, Luther in Culture 1, Luther in Culture 4, might seem controversial to some.
Well, I think that the answer to your point is that, in fact, I have a feeling that John O'Malley's approach to the whole matter is deeply rooted in psychology. And that what we are all touched by is a deep sense of humanity and this ability to read people's intention and cultural means of expression in a deeply psychological way. And what is extraordinary is that in these few pages, when you read about Gregory or about Luther, you feel human beings actually tackling with their passion or tackling with issues which they think are absolutely fundamental to the history of humanity. And I think that it's the beauty of this book, to me, is a kind of guidebook to one's day-to-day life. And I think that it is a testimony probably to, to the Jesuit implication in daily life, to provide, a perception of culture rooted in politics or whatever, but there's a kind of common denominator which makes that Luther may have started as a Catholic reformer and ended up something else, but that, you know, at first it was this urge to do something. And I must say that this book, as for a non-academic, is an incredible help. And as you said, on all levels, might it be in understanding AIDS or anything. I think that's really, that can be an answer to your question.
I haven't read the book, and I just wondered if you'd, since you'll know a lot about this, two things. It seems very Jesuit. In other words, it reminds me of the type of humanistic study that the Jesuits pushed, and in a way it's bringing the totality of Western culture into that framework. And when I say Jesuit, I say that positively, but I'm also having a reservation. And it is that generally when you do talk about the religious, you not only talk about the prophetic, but you also talk about the mystical. And there was a side to the Wirkungsgeschichte of the spiritual exercises. There was a tendency to kind of downplay the mystical and to emphasize the exercises in a kind of practical, action-oriented, decision-oriented. Just a question. I wonder if that's not reflected somehow in the overall way the book is set up.
So you're saying that the book would not account for a mystical approach to reality?
Well, I'm only asking.
Yes.
Because it didn't come out in the
No,
presentation.
you're right. You're very right to point that out.
When I was reading, on the Culture 3, I kept thinking, in 1981 I was a student of John's in a class, and it was called Luther, Erasmus, and Aquinas. So it gives you an idea of how long John's been thinking of this. But, these were the three persons, and it was really rather key. However, when I was reading Culture 3, I kept writing down the spiritual exercises all the time because I suddenly understood why the spiritual exercises were so brief. It was because they were not giving you Culture 2. They were not giving you the what of the exercises. They were exhorting you to be animated by the spirit that you would encounter in the encounter of the exercises. So it was there that I kept finding myself being led to a different place as a person to encounter something other. And the mystical comes up also in Culture 4, but for me, it was in Culture 3. It's attentiveness to vision. It's attentiveness to the ideal and to the person that suddenly I found myself being taken to a different place. John may want to answer that. Is he comment?
We're getting towards the end, though.
Yeah.
Yes, we are.
Can I have the final word?
Yes. Because it's 6:35.
I'm John O'Malley. I wrote the book. I want to thank you all. It was really very wonderful to hear you, and I learned a lot from just listening. I just want to make a few points about the book. One thing that surprised me was that nobody made much of the what I think is the heart of my treatment of Cultures 2 and 3, that is to say those two institutions, the founding of the university, which is a great turning point, and then with Culture 3, the founding of the humanistic schools in the Renaissance, which continued up into the 20th century, and that they were the engines, the principal engines for those cultures. That's one point. Louise, the original title of the book, when I sent it to the press, was Four Cultures of Western Christianity. But the editors there talked me out of it, and I go back and forth whether it was a good decision or not a good decision. In some ways, I'm happy with the title because I think the point of the book is Christianity is the
or the illustrations of these cultures, that the book is not reading directly, I mean, it's not fundamentally, profoundly about Christianity. It's about these cultures. Another thing that struck me is, that I thought did not come out so much in the discussion, is the 16th century, of course, is the century of my specialty, but also it's the century, I think, in which, as I try to treat these cultures, in which they confronted each other in sort of a bare-faced way, and they showed their true colors in a dramatic way. And then finally, to Larry and other people, yeah, this is about the Mediterranean world because it's that aspect, it's those cultures of the West that I'm interested in, and they're not to be all the mystic doesn't fit here. It's not here because it's not in those four strands that I see. So those would just be a few points I make. Thank you very much.
We thank Father Kennedy and the Jesuit Institute for making this evening possible, John for being here, our respondents, and all of you. Thank you and good evening.